Warning! It's impossible to talk about Cold Steel 2 without referencing all of Cold Steel 1, so if you want to know what I think about Cold Steel 1, go watch my video on it first. And that's not entirely a vanity plug. I'm actually not too fond of a lot of my output, but my review of Cold Steel is easily the video I come back to the most, cringe at least, and is ultimately the one I'm most proud of. And it was in thinking of how much I liked that video that I realised how much I actually like Cold Steel 1. So much so that the sequel is one of 2 games I was excited for all year. The other was Mankind Divided, and well, we all know what I think about that game. But if you're wondering why I'm still flagging behind and getting my opinion out despite my excitement, it's because the game has different distributors between regions that caused a 2-month delay on this side of the pond. Okay, I can sort of understand this being a thing for physical copies, but in 2016 I don't understand the discrepancy when it comes to putting games up on a digital marketplace. Like, legit, Atlas and Nintendo like to do this too, and despite my best efforts I haven't been able to find out why. So I had to mute a few people on Twitter to avoid spoilers while they got to have all the fun for 2 months. I would really like to not have to do this for Cold Steel 3, but I have my doubts that it will happen. Anyway, you still play as Reen Schwarzer, and the game still has a peculiar understanding of what constitutes black hair. It's been a month since he and Valimar escaped the coup at Fours, and the first hour simply consists of walking Reen back to civilization, assessing the situation from there. So you walk from the Isengard range to Reen's hometown of Ymir, where his sister is kidnapped, and you formulate a plan with the help of your robot buddy to find the scattered Class 7 and bring the band back together. Now, there's not a lot to say about the intro. It highlights that the voice discrepancies are back once again, but other than that it effectively answers every pressing question that was just left hanging at the end of Cold Steel 1 when the story just cuts to the credits. It is worth noting that the game lets you import your clear data from the first, but as you can imagine it's not like you get to keep all the best gear. Fare thee well, Byakuya, I suppose. Spoilers, there is no other gear named after Danganronpa characters, but there are worse references, we'll get to that. Really, I'm surprised how little is brought over. Near as I can tell, a save file will only boost your combat links a little, give you bonuses depending on your final experience level, and bring along 2 story choices from the first game, neither of which really matter. I held off on importing the game for this, by the way. Anyway, if the last game was the takeoff of Final Fantasy Type-O, that would make the structure to this a pretty clear parallel to Mass Effect 2. Going around the nation and trying to find your old crew to nip an impending threat in the bud, while seeing what said old pals were up to while they presumed you were dead. It's eerily similar, at least for the first half, but that's okay. Mass Effect 2 was the only game in the series with a pulse, and I refuse to be told otherwise. Indeed, having more of a through line is probably the biggest separation between Cold Steels 1 and 2. The problem that plagued Cold Steel up until the final act was the crux of your actions and the ultimate murkiness of it all. Its school chores made for a very unintelligible curriculum. Cold Steel 2 fixes it right up by explaining most of the stakes straight away. It's a civil war, the Noble Alliance has taken an easy lead, and their victory seems inevitable but for an ace in the hole to turn the tides, and it's established early on that Valimar, the mech, is brought up to be the only thing with a chance of directly competing with the nobility's foothold, so it's up to Reen to decide how far he wants to take things. And he makes the smart decision to just pace himself, to get the class back before deciding on their overall objective as a group. So unlike in the first game, where you were doing odd jobs for the school with no real payoff, the main story has a real sense of advancement, even if the first half is a bit ham-fisted and systematic. It's convenient that there are 3 old members of the class per town they can visit. These are also on the eastern side of the Empire, which just happened to be the towns you went to on all those excursions in the last 8 months. Which is a big problem with the game itself. There are not many new environments, and the ones that are new might as well be the same anyway. That said, the locational world building is as strong as ever, and the first game's biggest asset of creating an enriching world has paid off so much here. Rare is a game that can invoke nostalgia simply within its own franchise, but in Cold Steel 2 I remembered the cultural makeup of all these places, and seeing how they transitioned in the months since visiting them, and especially looking at how the war has affected these places, was gratifying. The best example is probably the Nord Highlands, where Gaius resides. Even though the situation with Kalvar to the north has simmered down a little, the Noble Alliance and the Jaegers they have hired are causing so much distress with the Imperial station there that the nomads have had to move once more, and it's legitimately stressful coming to a hastily moved camp with so much refuse left behind before hearing from the chief that if things don't change, they might have to leave the Highlands entirely. The atmosphere of the Civil War is suitably pervasive. I really got the impression that although there hasn't been too much blood up to this point, that things could heat up in an instant, and that the Noble Alliance really knew what they were doing. Keldic, the market town from the first game, is struggling as fuck, because even without that trade agreement that was foisted on them in Cold Steel 1, the provincial army is just breathing down their necks. And even with the minor fumbles that I'll get to, it feels like a huge game in scale. It feels like an appropriate epic of a wartime story. In saying that, I could have seen myself getting bored of it if it was just, look how fucked things are since you left. But CS2 balances the stakes of the world very well with the personal quests of our characters. The first member of Class 7 Reen finds again is, hey, it's the guy with the gun! But the separation anxiety Reen feels in the lead up to finding his classmates is portrayed with an appropriate level of emotional intensity. It starts off being crabby towards the talking cat, for essentially stranding them all, even for his safety, before taking a step back, breathing in, and thinking about what to do next. So what could have been just a cheesy reunion feels real and hits right in the gut by the time you find every other member. And yes, that includes Elisa. This culminates with Eustace, the only classmate who has real hang-ups about rejoining the party because of his ties and obligations he's made in the month Reen was up in the mountains. And his speech about motivation and clarity highlights the genius behind the direction of the game. Although it held true for the first too, viewing the Civil War through the eyes of Class 7, the diverse but altogether green band of brothers, anchors the heaviness of the war and gives us something to fight for on a personal level, while being able to connect with the motivations of a fairly big cast of characters, and seeing them struggle with their differing beliefs but refusing to compromise because they all ultimately follow the same goal of trying to end the war as fast as possible is nothing short of riveting. But it's also good that while Class 7 is the ultimate focus, the war and its instigators are used very well to cast a shadow on their efforts and throw some cold water on the spirit of camaraderie from time to time. Because Reen's constant speeches about friendship and how much everyone means to him are well written and realistic, but sometimes tiptoe up to the line of corniness, it was imperative Falcom realise what the class can accomplish without committing to anything, at least in the first half. One of the best scenes of the first few hours is dialogue aboard the airship amongst a ton of different villains. Cartoony as some of them definitely are, there's a sense of oppression with how these obstacles are clearly laid out and, again, demonstrates how little power the class ultimately has. But it also shows that even the villains have their own subdivisions and their own motivations, and it's not just a classical tale of good versus evil, but this complex story of political intrigue. Which was true at first, but again, the Civil War angle lights a fire underneath the thing and makes it feel much more awe-inspiring. Like, I didn't want to bring up comparisons to Final Fantasy XIII again, but it only occurs to me now, even after having beaten the latter two. That was a trilogy. That was meant to be a trilogy statement. And I just can't see how that's not meant to be regarded as one of the most incongruous series of games ever. Especially Lightning Returns, which had nothing to do with anything. Has anyone, actually taken on that series as a series? Maybe I should do what I did with Dead Space. I mean, we all know Noah Caldwell Gervais is not going to get to it. Whereas playing Cold Steel 2, I felt like everything in Cold Steel 1, overlong as it was, paid off, and it was just kinda humbling for this game to feel like a piece of a larger puzzle, which itself is the piece of a larger puzzle. You just don't have many pieces of art with this level of aspiration. The best we have is the Marvel Cinematic Universe with its fucking 7-year lead up to Thanos. I cannot stress how good it is they nailed the characterization, because even ignoring all the side characters, Cold Steel has a pretty big cast. But they're all cool, they're all suitably different, and they have different interactions. I actually didn't mind that Marquis and Eustace still fight each other, as the only members of the class who still really bicker with each other. It lends energy to the class's overall chemistry. Gaius being so soft-spoken but still silently driven makes him stand out amongst everyone else who seems to jump at what they want, but he still fits in perfectly. And as for Emma, It was really annoying for CS1 to just throw all the supernatural elements at you in the final dungeon. In CS2 there's much better build up because the legends that describe everything weird in this world actually feel like legends. Emma finally coming out as a witch and Reen having to assure her that she's a classmate before that is a suitable conclusion to her having to hide her secret so much at school. And that's Cold Steel 2 in a nutshell. It's a really emotionally satisfying payoff to the first game, with a much more interesting narrative with well developed characters and a great sense of place and atmosphere. What? Gameplay? What's that? Okay, there's barely anything to say about the combat. It's almost identical to the first. Same focus on multi-layered effects rather than singular nail-biting decisions. Same late-game meta that skews too hard towards S-breaks. Same focus towards efficiency for maximum XP bonuses. It's pretty good, but I would advise people who want to play this game not to make the same mistake I did, and instead put the game on hard. Boss fights aside, it's way too easy this time around. The biggest mechanical addition is Overdrive, where two party members using their combat link can use up one of these icons to fill their stats a little and get a few free turns. It takes ages to charge, but it's not as overpowered as I feared it would be. Aside from some way late additions, that's the only truly new facet to the combat, but there was a fair bit of tweaking done to inventory and stat management this time. A problem I neglected to mention in the review of the first was with how it handled level scaling. Obviously, if you have different students in your party for long stints of time, you can't level some of them up on your own, right? Cold Steel 1 got around this by scaling the experience levels of students in different study groups, which prevented level decay but mostly made buying new equipment pointless and made it confusing in case they got new special abilities in the meantime. CS2 gets around this by keeping inventory consistent, as far as I could tell, and making you earn new crafts by having party members win battles, but still keeping level scaling so no one truly flags behind. They also changed how the Arcus units work. Instead of unlocking slots, you have to spend Sepith to upgrade the slots to allow use of quartz with multiple effects, and unlocking these can get really expensive. In fact, a lot of things are expensive. I don't think the exchange rates have changed, although I kind of wish they did. That would have added another layer to the wartime environment. But the drop rate for Sepith mass, which is what you turn into money, is very low, so some care is required in picking what to buy. It does a lot more to justify the cooking system because it's much more cost efficient to make food than to buy potions, which again harkens to the gameplay bent of efficiency. Sadly, none of this really saves the game from some very standard JRPG pacing problems. It takes much longer for the game to reveal a pattern, unlike the last game which was all pattern, but there are still noticeable lulls between significant events because of what you're asked to physically do. There's a lot of dungeon trawling through 3 floors apiece, a lot of wandering around linear paths to find chests while doing some meandering side mission, and a lot of downtime in the hubs where you go where the exclamation mark tells you to advance the plot. Admittedly, the side missions are nowhere near as inane, even though there's still quite a bit of finding lost kittens. Why is this such a specific thing that happens in Cold Steel? And as great as the overall atmosphere is, there are parts where the story flags in places too, and you can see the fingerprints of the creators a little too much for my liking. I mean, I like how it takes much longer for a pattern to reveal itself, right down to the costumes, which were a lot more ragged and renegade than the school uniforms, but there are still too many once per episode isms. If Reen doesn't use his nine-tailed spirit powers to save the day, he'll call in Valimar, and if he doesn't do that, some old character from the first game will swoop in at the last minute. Both sides have too many aces up their sleeves which they can just pull out when it looks like the going is tough. This is especially frustrating because it's almost always after a really tough boss, where even if you win, your party still looks winded. And if this were a short game, this would all be fine, but, well, that obviously isn't the case. It's a weird situation. The positives of Cold Steel 2 all feel particular, and it's a huge step up on the first game, but the framework is a bit too JRPG for my liking. This is not a genre I play very often, and it creates a really weird paradox here. The story of Cold Steel 2 is incomprehensible without having played Cold Steel 1, but the gameplay is so very similar, and for a 60-hour game that feeling of repetition sinks in much quicker. The biggest distinction between the two, in the moment-to-moment gameplay, is in how much worse the battle music is in 2. So yeah, you can bet this failed the test in record time.
Fuck you.
But this is all before the halfway mark, where the game makes a dramatic shift. Just as Class 7 is finally reunited, and it feels like a core plot can form beyond that, the leader of the Alliance kidnaps Rean and asks if he wants to join forces, which leads to a very good intermission where we find out Crow's backstory. Crow is the Darth Vader of the last game, in case you forgot. And it's a really solid motivation for having him go to the lengths of killing the Chancellor. Soon after, you actually get to talk with pretty much all the villains on very casual terms, one of them even describing Rean's weird ogre powers in a way that invariably helps him finally control it. It's an interesting slice of downtime with curveball characterization on the level of a visual novel, but how many times do you really sit down with the cronies and talk about what they're fighting for? I loved this chapter, and it ends with an exciting escape sequence that leads to basically all of the characters meeting up and pointing their guns at each other before they all decide to mutually walk away. This time, it's a very anime situation, but it makes for a great climax. Honestly, this is where the first game should have ended, and not just because of well, you know. The game's format changes quite a bit. Similar to Final Fantasy X, you get control of an airship where you can touch down on liberated soil at your leisure, and the game turns from simply finding Class 7 to finding as many Force classmates as possible in an eventual attempt to take back the Academy itself. That comprises most of the side quests, and these diversions are finally engaging because the rewards are so much more tangible than just some points that say, "You done good." The airship's facilities get upgraded with each new student on hand to help run it, so it is absolutely worth bringing on board as many as you can. But on top of that, I was impressed by how well I remembered some of these characters entirely. It's a testament to Cold Steel's writing that the Scottish merchant girl came off as an actual character and not just a gimmick. Honestly, thinking about it after the fact, it might just rival the almighty Persona 4. I love just about every student, even the stupid ones, and especially Beryl. Beryl is the best character of the series, and I will hear no word to the contrary. Why isn't she in Class 7? The main missions are usually punctual hostage rescue operations or diversions that let the Imperial Army sneak in and retake a town. I like that they're carefully framed in a way that makes it that only the crew of the courageous can solve, but again, there are a few too many instances of, oh, this is going to happen during the mission, I can tell. The mech battles are really good, but you can tell when pretty much all of them are going to happen. It lags behind in form a little until the human cost of the war actually kicks in, but at the same time I didn't feel like I was doing anything because I felt I had to. Again, I did all the side missions, but this time I was actually invested in my actions, and it really feels like you're taking part in this civil war as this ragtag third party with unofficial royal and public backing in a way that makes your exploits feel gratifying in a Red Dawn sort of way. There's something kind of grandiose and complex in what you're doing in Cold Steel 2 that makes it much more interesting than the school chores the first game saddled you with, and it's impressive how carefully the game balances Rean's personal growth and his own psychoses, his interactions with his classmates, the outcome of the war in Erebonia, the brewing turmoil across the border, and just how deep the villain's plans go. It just feels awe-inspiring to be part of something bigger while still making your core actions feel relevant, and I'm not just saying that because of my personal insecurities in real life. Hey yo! There's not much else to talk about before the ending, but I guess I have a few scattered observations. Now, the localization is generally much better. I think I only saw one typo this time. However, I do have a hang up with one of the referential choices they made. Anaconda by Nicki Minaj. Let's just say it doesn't really have legs as a meme, because it's a snake. Legitimate gripe for voice acting. There are some returning characters who they could not get voices for again, and it's really distracting. Seeing who is voiced and who is not in any particular scene is an easy way to tell who's going to be important, which highlights the artifice in an uncomfortable way. The production values in general hold this game back. The presence of voice acting is just so much more inconsistent this time around, though they do have the good grace to actually tell us the voice actors this time. Hey, Million was voiced by Ashley Birch. When I said that, I was honestly just spitballing. Kind of like how everyone was spitballing when they said Michael McConaughey was the voice of Arside, even though everyone knew it was Michael McConaughey, because it's Michael McConaughey.
And the Shy Gen's enigmatic Wang.
Good times. Anyway, obligatory ending talk. The most I can say in a spoiler-free way is that it doesn't cut itself off this time. Quite the opposite, actually. You want to see how ridiculous it gets? If not, here's a timestamp. If so, watch on. After liberating Fours, the class gets one last task, to rescue the royal family just outside the capital city, which is fair enough. I knew it wasn't gonna end just when our game was personally satisfied, mostly because I wouldn't have been. But right after accomplishing that mission, A huge fucking castle just sprouts in the middle of the city and it looks like the end times. So the class has to make one final push into the capital to see what's up. What's up is possibly the worst final dungeon in gaming. A single floor should not take an hour and a half, and it certainly shouldn't end the same way each time. Is this what people were complaining about with Bravely Default? I feel like it's about as redundant. I ended up just muting the TV and playing it in the background while watching Best of the Worst the entire time. But eventually, you hit the end and have your big final battle with Crow, which really the whole game has been leading up to. And I appreciate that it's a more friendly rivalry than the cold, throwing Reen's friendship back in his face that the climax to Cold Steel 1 was. It feels more rewarding to trump him on that sort of equal footing. Of course, you can't have the mustache-twirling bad guy blindfold and kidnap the young prince and try to use him to power a giant hell robot without having a boss fight against a giant hell robot. It is ultimately a success, but Crow has to make a heroic sacrifice to give them an opening. I actually like the breakdown everyone has at this, even though obviously Crow has killed the Chancellor, there's blood on his hands. But the Lamentations of Class 7 make it feel like a Pyrrhic victory. You saved a prince but lost a friend along the way. If it had closed there, with Vita the omnipotent witch limping off into the distance, I would have called it a fitting end. But there's a couple of real curveballs made right after. First of all, remember when I just said Crow killed the Chancellor? Yeah, that didn't happen. Second, remember when I called Crow the Darth Vader of the game? Yeah, that didn't happen. And then it smash cuts to a credit card and I was really worried there wasn't even going to be an epilogue. But then, I wished there wasn't. This extra chapter could have been really cool. You take control of a couple of people allied with Crossbell, the nation east of Erebonia, which Erebonia has actually just annexed. Considering what happened last time Erebonia did this, it's a real oh shit moment. So you go through a hidden underground sector trying to wipe the personal details of people connected to the opposition of the Blood and Iron Chancellor, but before you can do that you have to fight Reen? That's pretty cool. But it doesn't stop the last few moments from just being confusing. At first I thought these were old characters from Trails in the Sky, but it's worse than that. These are characters from a Trails game that hasn't even been translated. So when Lloyd starts rattling off names of his friends, what should be a nostalgia bomb instead is just this confusing, rambly clusterfuck. And after that the game's still not over. You go back to school for a few more days, and after the invigorating journey of trying to foil the nobility from performing a widespread coup d'etat on an entire nation, the final chapter begins with you doing school chores again! God, who even thought this was a good idea after a game that handled its gravitas with flair? Although there is one very touching scene where Reen finally breaks down and confronts his failure to bring Crow back.
Oh, sorry. I promised I'd bring him back. I promised I'd make him graduate with you.
That's some good delivery. And I predicted this was coming and I was dreading it, but once again, the schoolhouse lights up with a peculiar aura and the whole class has to go in and solve one last dungeon. A randomly generated 20-floor mammoth with the best loot of the game and nowhere else left to use it. What baffles me about this section, beyond how fucking boring it is how on its face pointless the whole scenario is. Up to this point, the only character who could use overdrive with everyone else was Reen, and he had to unlock these trial chests for the rest of the class. Here, everyone gets to use overdrive. It's almost like the process was completely worthless. Even the final boss says straight up there's no reason to fight him and no reward for doing so. Fighting the Black Shadow at the end of the first is how you got Valimar, which is an instrumental part of the second game's plot. Fighting off the White Phantom? It makes everyone unleash their feelings because they realise the end of their school life is just around the corner. That seems to be it. To be fair, I like the general sentiment. Even without visiting the dorms and asking everyone what's up, there's this sense that everyone has their own stuff to do outside of school after graduating, and who knows if they'll see each other again, and it's very sad. But this scene where everyone starts bawling, the game in general has a mild problem with announcing its themes at face value with Reen's big speeches, but this is the only time it becomes too corny to work. The wartime drama is completely gone by this point, and the absolute final scene at the train station is a bit too Azumanga Daioh for my liking. It's a shame. If they had cut off the last 7 hours and ended the game right here, I would have been satisfied. Instead, the game just drags on beyond the conclusion of the main story. I mean, look how huge the level gets. If the cap goes beyond 100, I think you can start questioning the reasonable, mechanical endpoint of the gameplay. I figured they were limping along trying to get to a real sequel hook, the kind that plagued the first game's ending, but no, there's a sense of finality here. At least we can say that the story has ended this... Oh, fuck off, Falcom. One final lick of the balls just to see us off. Yeah, because we all know Cold Steel 3 is right around the corner, right? And yes, it is a game that exists, and we even know Veen and Elisa are going to be in it, but it's going to be a long wait. Particularly if there's no simultaneous release between America and Europe again. Well anyway, I would have called this a great, verging on fantastic game without the last 2 chapters, but like Mankind Divided, the finale is such a letdown. Unlike Mankind Divided, there's plenty of consistent quality to be found elsewhere. There were even a number of times that Cold Steel 2 impressed me, making this probably the best JRPG I've played besides Persona 4. Granted, that's not a long list, but this has probably the most inventive and impressive storytelling I've seen in one of these since Resonance of Fate, maybe? No one really remembers that game anymore, although I'm happy the costume customization is as wacky between the 2 games, as you've seen up to this point. The story is incredible and it's a veritable improvement on Cold Steel 1, but it's still too easy to tear yourself away for a couple of rounds of Overwatch. All I can say is, boy am I glad Sombra is finally out. You know, it just occurred to me that Sombra is both a hacker and a Mexican girl, and they still decided to reference the movie no one remembers, but they couldn't squeeze in an "I'm in your area" voice line. Is it because of copyright fears? Because if so, I'm gonna say the same thing to whoever translates JoJo these days. Fucking cow! You are Isaac Clarke, haha, I get it. An engineer on a mission to investigate the communications blackout of the planet cracker USG Ishimura. The game starts with Task Force Operation in... hey, I know a lot of other well-written critical games have come out between HR and now, but this is starting to look like... yeah, no prizes for guessing what game Mankind Divided starts out trying to be. このデスゲームが開始されて2年近くが経過した。 That's
you. That's how dumb you sound.
It's very hard, even when picking the dialogue yourself, not to make the main character of Aki fighting Ace look like a complete tosser. I would go as far as to say to make the main character this outwardly pathetic was a daring move.